The basket slipped from Rosalie's trembling fingers and hit the ground with a muffled thud, scattering half a dozen warm eggs across the dirt as she spun around to face the man standing in the doorway of the henhouse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the pre-dawn light of Del Rio, Texas, in the spring of 1878. Rosalie Lawson had thought she was being quiet, had been certain that the rancher who owned this spread would still be asleep in his bed at this ungodly hour. But there he stood with his arms crossed over his chest, wearing nothing but trousers and a loose shirt that hung open at the collar. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, and even in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the henhouse walls, she could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes as they took in the sight of her clutching his eggs like a common thief. "I'm sorry," she gasped, bending immediately to gather the fallen eggs, her face burning with humiliation. "I'll pay you back, I swear it. My sister, she's sick, and we haven't had anything to eat in 2 days, and I thought maybe just a few eggs wouldn't be missed." Ethan Pierce watched the young woman scramble to retrieve the eggs she had dropped, noting the way her hands shook and how thin she looked in the pale cotton dress that hung loose on her frame. He could see every delicate bone in her wrists, could count the vertebrae visible through the worn fabric at the back of her neck, where her long, reddish-brown hair had fallen forward. She was perhaps 20 years old, with a face that would have been pretty if not for the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the desperate fear in her green eyes. "Hold on there," he said, his voice gentler than she had expected. "You're going to crush those if you're not careful." Rosalie froze, still crouched on the ground with her hands cupped around one of the eggs. She looked up at him warily, expecting him to yell, to threaten her with the sheriff, to demand payment she could not possibly give. Instead, he walked past her to where several woven baskets hung from hooks on the wall, selected the largest one, and began methodically collecting eggs from the nesting boxes. "Your sister," he said without looking at her. "How old is she?" 14, Rosalie whispered. "She took fever 3 days ago, and it's gotten worse. I've been trying to bring it down with cool cloths, but she needs food, needs to build her strength back up." Ethan filled the basket until it was nearly overflowing with eggs, easily 3 dozen or more. Then he turned and held it out to her, watching as confusion and disbelief warred across her expressive face. "Take the whole basket for your sister," he said simply. Rosalie stared at him as though he had just offered her the moon. "I can't," she said, even as her hands reached involuntarily toward the basket. "That's too much. I only needed a few. If your sister is as sick as you say, she'll need proper nourishment to recover. Eggs alone won't do it." He pressed the basket into her hands despite her protests. "Can you cook?" She nodded mutely, still looking at him as though expecting him to snatch the basket back at any moment. "Good. Come up to the house. I'll give you some salt pork and beans to go with these." "Why?" The word escaped her before she could stop it. "Why are you being kind to me?" "I was stealing from you." Ethan had been asking himself the same question from the moment he had spotted her slipping into his henhouse from the window of his bedroom. He had pulled on his clothes and followed, intending to frighten off what he assumed was a fox or coyote. Instead, he had found this slip of a girl who looked like a strong wind might blow her away, and something in his chest had tightened at the sight of her. "Because you were stealing to feed a sick child, not to line your own pockets," he said after a moment. "And because I've got more than I need while you clearly have less. Doesn't seem right to make a fuss about a few eggs." He walked out of the henhouse without waiting to see if she would follow, and after a moment's hesitation, Rosalie hurried after him, clutching the basket against her chest like precious treasure. The ranch house was modest but well-maintained, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Ethan led her through the back door into a kitchen that was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's home. Sit, he instructed, gesturing to the sturdy wooden table. You look like you're about to fall over. Rosalie wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but her legs were trembling beneath her, and the chair looked impossibly inviting. She sank into it gratefully, setting the basket of eggs on the table in front of her. Ethan moved around the kitchen with the easy competence of a man who had been cooking for himself for years, pulling down a wrapped parcel of salt pork from a hook in the ceiling, scooping dried beans into a cloth sack, adding a small tin of lard. "Where are you living?" he asked as he worked. "Old Hernandez place, about 2 miles east of here." Ethan paused in his gathering. "That property's been abandoned for near 5 years. Can't imagine it's in good condition." "It keeps the rain off our heads," Rosalie said quietly. "Mostly." He added a tin of coffee to the growing pile of supplies, then hesitated before reaching for a small jar of honey. "This will help with the fever," he said. "Mix a spoonful in warm water and have her drink it 3 times a day." Rosalie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this stranger, would not add to her humiliation by breaking down in his kitchen. "I don't know how to thank you," she managed, "but I will pay you back, every cent. I'm looking for work. As soon as I find something, I'll bring you the money." "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, sewing. I can read and write and do figures. I'm not afraid of hard work." Ethan studied her for a long moment, taking in the proud set of her shoulders despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The way she met his eyes directly even though her hands trembled in her lap. An idea was forming in his mind, one that he knew was probably foolish but that he could not quite dismiss. "I could use some help around here," he said slowly. "Nothing too strenuous, but the house needs a woman's touch and I'm tired of my own cooking. If you're interested, I'd pay fair wages. 50 cents a day, plus meals." Rosalie's eyes went wide. 50 cents a day was more than generous for household work, and with meals included, she could save every penny for medicine if Emma's fever did not break soon. But a young, unmarried woman working alone for a bachelor rancher. The scandal would be immense, even in a rough town like Del Rio. "What would people say?" she asked quietly. "To hell with what people say," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "You need work, I need help. That's all that matters. But if you're worried about your reputation, I can ask Mrs. Chen from the neighboring ranch to come by as a chaperone a few days a week. She's been after me to hire proper help anyway." Rosalie wanted to say yes so badly that it felt like a physical ache in her chest, but she forced herself to think practically. "My sister. I can't leave her alone all day, not while she's sick. Bring her here. The spare bedroom is just sitting empty. She can rest in a proper bed while you work, and you can look after her throughout the day. Once she's well, we can reassess the arrangement." It was too much, too generous, and every instinct Rosalie had screamed that there must be a catch, that no man offered such kindness without expecting something in return. But when she looked into Ethan's steady brown eyes, she saw only honest concern and a straightforward practicality that reminded her of her father before he had died. "All right," she said softly. "Yes, thank you." Ethan felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he had not expected. "Good. Can you start today? Or do you need time to get your sister settled first?" "Today," Rosalie said quickly. "The sooner I start, the sooner I can begin repaying your kindness." "This isn't charity," Ethan said firmly. "This is honest work for honest pay. Don't go thinking you owe me anything beyond a fair day's labor." But as Rosalie gathered up the supplies he had given her and prepared to make the 2-mile walk back to the dilapidated Hernandez place, she knew that she already owed him more than she could possibly repay. He had seen her at her lowest moment, had caught her stealing like a common criminal, and instead of turning her into the law, he had offered her dignity, work, and hope. The walk back seemed shorter than the walk there had been, perhaps because her basket was so much heavier, or perhaps because her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Emma was still feverish when Rosalie returned, tossing restlessly on the thin mattress they shared in the single room of the old adobe house that did not have a hole in the roof. "Rosie," Emma's voice was thread and confused. "Where did you go?" "Hush, sweetheart," Rosalie soothed, pressing a cool cloth to her sister's forehead. "I got us food and I found work, real paying work. Everything is going to be all right now." She scrambled eggs in the dented pot that was their only cookware, adding bits of the salt pork and watching with satisfaction as Emma managed to eat nearly half of what she had prepared. The honey mixed in warm water seemed to help as well, and by mid-morning, Emma's fever had dropped slightly. "I need you to be brave," Rosalie said gently as she packed their few belongings into the canvas bag that held everything they owned. "We're going to stay at the ranch where I'll be working, just until you're well. The man who owns it, Mr. Pierce, he's been very kind. He has a spare room where you can rest properly." Emma's eyes, so like their mother's had been, filled with worry. "Is he a good man, Rosie? You won't let him hurt you?" "He's a good man," Rosalie said with more certainty than she felt. "He could have had me arrested for stealing his eggs, but instead he gave me a basket full and offered me honest work. That says something about his character." The walk to the Pierce ranch with a fevered 14-year-old leaning heavily on her shoulder was arduous, and Rosalie was grateful when Ethan spotted them from the corral where he was working with a young colt and came striding over immediately. "Let me help," he said, and before Rosalie could protest, he had scooped Emma up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. "The fever's still bad. Better than it was this morning, but yes, still bad." He carried Emma into the house and up the stairs to the spare bedroom, which was simple but clean, with a real bed frame and a mattress that looked like heaven compared to the thin pallet on the floor that the sisters had been sharing. He laid Emma down gently and stepped back, looking uncomfortable in the way of men unused to sick rooms. "I'll get some fresh water," he said, and disappeared before Rosalie could thank him. Over the next 3 days, Rosalie fell into a routine that felt almost normal. She woke before dawn to start the fire in the kitchen stove, prepared breakfast for Ethan and herself, checked on Emma, and then set about the endless tasks of maintaining a household. She cleaned windows that had not been properly washed in years, scrubbed floors, beat rugs, and reorganized the pantry with a meticulousness that would have made her mother proud. Ethan was gone most days, working with his cattle or mending fences or dealing with the 100 other tasks that came with running a ranch. But in the evenings, he would return to find a hot meal waiting, and the house transformed a little more each day. He found himself looking forward to those evenings, to sitting across the table from Rosalie and hearing about her day, about Emma's gradual improvement, about the garden she wanted to plant if he would allow it. On the 4th day, Emma's fever finally broke completely, and she woke clear-eyed and hungry for the first time in over a week. Rosalie cried with relief, and when Ethan came in for lunch and heard the news, he found himself grinning like a fool. "She'll need to build her strength back up," he cautioned, but his eyes were warm with genuine pleasure at the news. "I know," Rosalie said, wiping at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "But she's going to be all right, thanks to you." "Thanks to good food and rest and her sister's devoted care," Ethan corrected. But Rosalie knew better. Without his intervention, without his inexplicable kindness to a stranger who had been stealing from him, Emma might not have made it. The knowledge created a debt she was determined to repay, even if he insisted it was not necessary. As the weeks passed and Emma regained her strength, Rosalie proved herself invaluable around the ranch. She was up before dawn and rarely stopped moving until well after dark, tackling every task with fierce determination. She mended Ethan's clothes, preserved vegetables from the garden she had planted, churned butter, made soap, and transformed the bachelor's residence into a proper home. Ethan found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way sunlight caught in her hair when she hung laundry to dry, the way she hummed softly to herself while she worked, the quick flash of her smile when Emma said something amusing. She was beautiful, he realized, though her beauty had been hidden by hunger and exhaustion when they first met. Now that she was eating properly and sleeping in a real bed, color had returned to her cheeks and her eyes sparkled with life. He was falling for her, he admitted to himself one evening as he watched her teach Emma to read from the old newspaper he had brought home from town. It was foolish and complicated and probably unwise, but there it was. Somewhere between finding her in his henhouse and watching her transform his house into a home, Ethan Pierce had lost his heart to Rosalie Lawson. The realization should have terrified him. He had been alone for so long, had convinced himself he preferred solitude after his parents died and left him the ranch. But now his house felt alive in a way it never had before, filled with feminine laughter and the smell of fresh bread and the warmth of companionship. Rosalie was falling too, though she tried desperately to deny it to herself. Ethan was everything she had never expected in a man. He was kind without being weak, generous without being patronizing, strong without being cruel. He treated her with respect, paid her fairly, and never once made her feel uncomfortable or afraid despite the fact that she was living under his roof. She loved the way he was patient with Emma, bringing her books from town and sitting with her in the evenings to teach her chess. She loved the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the way he always removed his hat when he came inside, the gentle way he handled the horses and cattle. She loved the sound of his voice, deep and steady and reassuring, and the way he smelled of leather and honest sweat and the outdoors. But she was his employee, she reminded herself sternly. He had hired her out of pity, had taken in two desperate women who had nowhere else to go. To imagine that his kindness meant anything more would be the height of foolishness. Mrs. Chen, who had indeed been coming by twice a week to preserve propriety, was less convinced of the arrangement's innocent nature. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon," she said one afternoon while they were making preserves in the kitchen. She was a practical woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "And you look at him the same way, though you try to hide it." "I do not," Rosalie protested, feeling her cheeks heat. "Child, I've been married 30 years. I know what attraction looks like and I know what love looks like. What I'm seeing here is both. He's my employer, nothing more. If you say so," Mrs. Chen said, clearly unconvinced. "But mark my words, something is growing between you two, whether you want to acknowledge it or not." That evening, Ethan asked Rosalie to take a walk with him after supper. Emma was feeling well enough to wash the dishes. She assured them with a knowing smile that made Rosalie want to sink through the floor, so there was no excuse to refuse. They walked in silence for a while, heading toward the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Ethan's property. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the air was sweet with the smell of wild flowers. "I've been thinking," Ethan said finally, stopping beside the creek and turning to face her, "about the arrangement we have." Rosalie's heart sank. Of course. Emma was well now, healthy and strong. There was no reason for them to continue living in his house, No reason for him to continue paying for help he probably did not really need. She had known this was coming, had been preparing herself for it, but it still hurt more than she had expected. "I understand," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the water. "Emma is well now. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough. I'll start looking for other accommodation tomorrow." "What? No, that's not what I meant at all." Ethan took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Rosalie, look at me." She raised her eyes to his reluctantly, afraid of what she might see there. "I don't want you to leave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to stay. Not as my employee, not out of obligation or charity, but because I care about you. Because somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my life, and the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I can't breathe." Rosalie stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Ethan, I don't understand. I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I think I have been since that first morning when you looked at me with such fierce pride despite being caught stealing eggs. You could have begged or cried or tried to manipulate me, but instead you promised to pay me back, promised to work for what you needed. You were so strong, so determined to protect your sister, and I was lost right then and there. You love me." Rosalie whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I love you," he confirmed. "And I know this is probably too soon, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I had to tell you. I had to let you know that when I think about my future, about what I want my life to look like, you're in every single vision. You and Emma both." Rosalie felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time she made no effort to hide them. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I've been trying so hard not to, trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was just gratitude, but it's more than that. So much more. You make me feel safe and valued and cherished in a way I never have before." Ethan closed the distance between them, cupping her face in his rough, calloused hands and wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Then stay," he said softly. "Not as my employee, but as my wife. Marry me, Rosalie. Let me take care of you and Emma properly, the way you both deserve." "Yes," Rosalie breathed. And then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as she wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "I was so nervous," he admitted. "I thought for sure you were going to turn me down." "Never," Rosalie said fiercely. "I would be honored to be your wife." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when Emma saw their joined hands and radiant faces, she let out a whoop of joy that could probably be heard all the way in town. "Finally," she exclaimed. "I've been watching you two make eyes at each other for weeks. I was starting to think I'd have to lock you in a room together." "Emma," Rosalie scolded, but she was laughing, her heart too full of happiness to sustain any real embarrassment. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Del Rio. Mrs. Chen stood as witness, along with her husband and several other neighboring ranchers who had become friends over the years. Emma stood beside her sister, glowing with health and happiness, holding the small bouquet of wildflowers they had picked that morning. Rosalie wore a dress of pale blue cotton that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, simple but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Ethan wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven, and when he saw Rosalie walking toward him down the aisle, his breath caught at how beautiful she looked. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. And when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ladies in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the trees and enough food to feed half the county. Mrs. Chen had organized everything with military precision, and neighbors arrived bearing covered dishes and wedding gifts and congratulations. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, someone produced a fiddle and soon music filled the air. Ethan led Rosalie in a dance, holding her close as they swayed to the music, and she felt as though her heart might burst from happiness. "Happy, Mrs. Pierce," Ethan murmured against her ear. "Deliriously," Rosalie replied, looking up at him with eyes that shone with love. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Emma had been settled in her room, Rosalie and Ethan finally had their wedding night. He was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what pleased her, and she gave herself to him with complete trust, knowing that she was safe in his hands. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, her head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her, and Rosalie thought about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had gone from stealing eggs in desperation to lying in the arms of a man who loved her, who had married her, who had given her and Emma a home and a future. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about that morning in the henhouse," she admitted. "If you had reacted differently, if you had called the sheriff or chased me off your property, where would I be now?" "Don't," Ethan said, tightening his arms around her. "Don't think about that. We found each other, and that's all that matters." "You're right," Rosalie agreed, pressing a kiss to his chest. "We found each other, and I intend to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." The months that followed were the happiest of Rosalie's life. She settled into her role as Ethan's wife with joy, managing the household and helping with the ranch work when needed. Emma thrived in the stable, loving environment, and began attending the small school in Del Rio, riding into town 3 days a week with Ethan when he went to conduct business. As autumn turned to winter and then to spring again, Rosalie discovered she was with child. She told Ethan one evening after supper, watching nervously for his reaction. His face went through a series of expressions before settling on pure joy, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby." Emma was equally thrilled at the prospect of becoming an aunt, and immediately began making plans for the nursery and knitting tiny booties with more enthusiasm than skill. The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Rosalie bloomed with health, her face glowing and her happiness evident to everyone who saw her. Ethan was impossibly protective, insisting she rest more and trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, much to her amusement. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she would tell him, but she secretly loved his attentiveness, the way he would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to their unborn child. In late summer of 1879, just over a year after that fateful morning in the henhouse, Rosalie went into labor. Mrs. Chen arrived to assist, along with the midwife from town, and after 12 hours of hard work, Rosalie delivered a healthy baby boy. Ethan held his son for the first time with trembling hands, marveling at the tiny perfect features, the small fists that waved in the air, the rosebud mouth that opened in a yawn. "He's perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Rosalie, he's perfect." "What should we name him?" Rosalie asked, exhausted but radiant as she watched her husband cradle their child. They had discussed names for months, debating the merits of various family names and meanings, but now, looking at his son, Ethan knew exactly what he wanted to call him. Thomas, he said, after your father, Thomas Lawrence Pierce. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears at the gesture, at Ethan's thoughtfulness in honoring the man who had raised her, who had died when she was just 17 and left her responsible for her younger sister. Thomas Lawrence Pierce, she repeated. It's perfect. Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, and both Rosalie and Ethan fell completely in love with him. Emma was a devoted aunt, always willing to hold him or sing to him or help with his care, and the house rang with the sounds of a happy family. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Rosalie sometimes found herself thinking about that desperate morning when she had crept into Ethan's henhouse to steal eggs. She thought about how frightened she had been, how hopeless the future had seemed, and how one act of kindness had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Ethan one night as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard while Emma supervised. "Taking us in, I mean. Your life was so much simpler before we came along." Ethan looked at her as though she had lost her mind. "Regret it?" "Rosalie, you and Emma and Thomas are the best things that ever happened to me. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live, a reason to build something meaningful. I thank God every day that you chose my henhouse to steal from." Rosalie laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their son play in the gathering darkness. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." 2 years later, Rosalie gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Marie after Ethan's mother. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had both of her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, gentle and protective in a way that made both Rosalie and Ethan's hearts swell with pride. Emma, now 16 and blossoming into a beautiful young woman, helped care for both children and began teaching at the school in Del Rio, much to everyone's pride. The ranch prospered under Ethan's management, and with Rosalie's careful household economy, they were able to purchase additional land and expand their herd. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. As the years passed, Rosalie and Ethan's love only deepened. They learned each other's rhythms, developed their own private jokes and rituals, built a life together that was rich with meaning and joy. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of tension and frustration, but they always talked through their problems, always chose forgiveness and understanding over resentment. Emma eventually married a young teacher who had come to Del Rio from Austin, a kind, studious man named James who treated her like precious treasure. The wedding was held at the ranch, just as Rosalie and Ethan's had been, and Rosalie cried happy tears as she watched her sister pledge her life to a good man who would cherish her. Thomas grew into a strong, capable boy who loved the ranch and the animals, who followed his father everywhere and soaked up everything Ethan could teach him about ranching and horses and treating people fairly. Catherine was bright and quick-witted, with a gift for numbers that astonished her teachers and a stubborn streak that reminded Ethan of her mother. In 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Catherine was 4, Rosalie gave birth to twin boys, Samuel and David. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, and afterward the doctor warned that she should not have more children. Ethan held her hand and promised that 4 children were more than enough, that he would not risk her life for anything. The twins were a handful, energetic and mischievous, constantly getting into trouble and keeping their older siblings on their toes. But they were also sweet-natured and loving, quick with hugs and laughter, and Rosalie could not imagine their family without them. As the children grew and the ranch continued to prosper, Ethan made sure to never forget the circumstances that had brought Rosalie into his life. Every year on the anniversary of that morning in the henhouse, he presented her with a basket of eggs and a note that read, "Thank you for choosing my henhouse." It became their private tradition, one that made Rosalie laugh and cry in equal measure, a reminder of how far they had come from that desperate morning when she had been stealing to feed her sister. In 1890, when the children ranged in age from 11 to 6, Ethan decided to build Rosalie the house she had always dreamed of. He had saved carefully, setting aside money each year, and now he was ready to give her something special. The new house was larger than the original ranch house, with a proper parlor and a big kitchen with a real stove, bedrooms for all the children, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Rosalie cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and love that had gone into every detail. "You've given me so much already," she protested. "You didn't need to do this." "I wanted to," Ethan said firmly. "You've worked so hard, been such a wonderful wife and mother. You deserve a house that matches the size of your heart." They moved into the new house in the spring, and Rosalie spent weeks arranging and decorating, making it into a proper home. She planted flowers around the porch and a vegetable garden behind the house, hung curtains she had sewn herself, and filled every room with evidence of their life together. As the years continued to pass, Rosalie and Ethan watched their children grow into fine young people. Thomas became Ethan's right hand on the ranch, capable and hardworking, with an eye for good cattle and a way with horses that rivaled his father's. Catherine went away to a teaching college in Austin and came back with a degree and a passion for education that led her to establish a proper school in Del Rio. The twins, Samuel and David, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in the mysterious way of twins. They were fascinated by mechanics and engineering, constantly taking things apart to see how they worked and usually managing to put them back together again. Emma and James had 3 children of their own, and the cousins grew up together, spending long summer days at the ranch, filling the house with laughter and noise. Family dinners became grand affairs, with 3 generations gathered around the big table in the dining room, passing platters of food and sharing stories. In 1895, Thomas announced that he wanted to marry Sarah Jensen, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. She was a sweet girl with a practical nature and a genuine love for ranch life, and Rosalie welcomed her into the family with open arms. Their wedding was a joyous occasion, and a year later, they made Rosalie and Ethan grandparents for the first time with the birth of a daughter they named Rose, after Rosalie. Holding her tiny granddaughter for the first time, Rosalie found herself thinking again about that morning in the henhouse, about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Ethan had reacted with anger instead of compassion, if he had called the sheriff or chased her away, none of this would exist. There would be no Thomas, no Catherine, no twins, no granddaughter with her name. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, coming to sit beside her on the porch where she sat rocking little Rose. "Just about how one moment of kindness can change everything," Rosalie said softly. "About how grateful I am that you chose compassion over anger that morning." Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I'm the one who should be grateful," he said. "You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have. A house full of love and laughter, children and now grandchildren, a partnership that has sustained me through everything life has thrown at us. I'm the lucky one, Rosalie." "We're both lucky," Rosalie said, leaning her head against his shoulder. We found each other at exactly the right moment, when we both needed each other most." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the ranch that had been the foundation of their life together. From inside the house came the sound of Catherine playing the piano, the twins arguing good-naturedly about something, Thomas and Sarah discussing plans for their own ranch. This was what happiness looked like, Rosalie thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but quiet evenings on the porch with the man she loved, surrounded by the family they had built together. This was the life she had never dared to dream of, when she was a desperate young woman stealing eggs to feed her sister. As the years continued their steady march forward, Rosalie and Ethan grew older together, their dark hair turning silver, lines deepening around their eyes and mouths, but their love remaining as strong as ever. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898 with a party that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. Emma gave a speech that had everyone in tears, talking about how Rosalie had sacrificed everything to keep her safe and healthy, how Ethan had shown kindness to two strangers when he had no reason to do so, how their love had been an example to everyone who knew them. "To Rosalie and Ethan," she said, raising her glass. "May they have 20 more years of happiness together, and may we all be so lucky as to find a love like theirs." The toast was echoed around the room, and Rosalie found herself crying happy tears as Ethan pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly, to the applause and cheers of their family and friends. Catherine married a lawyer from San Antonio and moved to the city, but she came home often, unable to stay away from the ranch and the family she loved for too long. The twins eventually went into business together, opening a shop in Del Rio where they repaired and built all manner of mechanical devices, from farm equipment to clocks. More grandchildren arrived as the years passed, each one a joy and a blessing. Rosalie loved being a grandmother, loved the way the children would run to her when they arrived for visits, loved teaching them to bake bread and tend the garden and ride horses. Ethan was equally devoted, spending hours telling them stories and teaching them the skills he had learned over a lifetime of ranching. In 1903, as they approached their 25th anniversary, Ethan began to plan something special. He worked with the children in secret, organizing a surprise that would show Rosalie just how much she meant to all of them. The day of their anniversary dawned bright and clear, and Rosalie woke to find Ethan already up and dressed, looking unusually mysterious. "What are you up to?" she asked suspiciously. "You'll see," he said with a smile. "Get dressed in your best. We're going on a little trip." Curious and slightly nervous, Rosalie did as instructed, putting on the dress Catherine had sent her for Christmas, a lovely creation in deep green silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Ethan helped her into the wagon, and they set off toward town. As they approached Del Rio, Rosalie was startled to see what looked like half the town gathered in the square. A large banner had been strung between two buildings, reading, "Congratulations Rosalie and Ethan Pierce, 25 years. "Ethan, what is this?" she gasped. "This is everyone who wanted to help us celebrate," he said simply. "Everyone whose life you've touched over the years." There was Mrs. Chen, now elderly but still sharp-eyed and smiling. There were neighbors from surrounding ranches, people from the church, Emma and James with their children, all of Rosalie and Ethan's children and grandchildren. The mayor of Del Rio stood on a platform, and as Ethan helped Rosalie down from the wagon, he began to speak. "We're gathered here today to honor two people who have been pillars of our community for 25 years, he said. "Ethan and Rosalie Pierce have shown us all what it means to build a life based on kindness, hard work, and genuine love. They have raised fine children who are now raising fine children of their own. They have been generous neighbors, faithful friends, and an inspiration to everyone who knows them. He went on to talk about the various ways the Pierces had contributed to the community over the years, the people they had helped, the example they had set. Rosalie stood beside Ethan, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. Then Thomas stepped forward, holding a large wrapped package. "Mama, Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We wanted to give you something that would show you how much you mean to us. This is from all of us, your children and grandchildren." Rosalie unwrapped the package with trembling hands to reveal a large painting. It showed the original ranch house, the henhouse visible in the background, and in the foreground, a young man handing a basket of eggs to a young woman. The artist had captured the moment perfectly, the kindness in Ethan's eyes, the disbelief and hope in Rosalie's face. "We had it commissioned based on the story you've told us so many times," Catherine explained. "The story of how you met, how one act of kindness changed all of our lives. Because without that moment, none of us would be here." Rosalie could not speak through her tears, could only pull each of her children into a fierce embrace, then her grandchildren, then stand wrapped in Ethan's arms while the whole town applauded. The celebration continued all day, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. As the sun began to set, Ethan led Rosalie to a quiet spot away from the crowd, and they sat together on a bench, watching their family and friends enjoy themselves. 25 years, Rosalie said softly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was that desperate girl stealing eggs. Other times it feels like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago," Ethan said, taking her hand and lacing their fingers together. "We've lived a whole life since then, you and I. Raised a family, built something meaningful, loved each other through good times and bad. And I would do it all again in a heartbeat," Rosalie said, turning to look at him. The silver in his hair glinted in the fading sunlight, and there were lines on his face that had not been there when they met, but to her, he was as handsome as he had been at 28. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would choose you again and again." "I love you, Rosalie Pierce," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left." "I love you too," Rosalie whispered. "Thank you for seeing something worth saving in that scared girl in your henhouse. Thank you for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams." They sat together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, surrounded by the sound of their family's laughter, wrapped in the warmth of a love that had endured for a quarter-century and showed no signs of fading. The years that followed were gentler, as Rosalie and Ethan gradually stepped back from the day-to-day work of the ranch and let Thomas take over more of the responsibility. They remained active and involved, offering advice when asked and help when needed, but they also allowed themselves to simply enjoy the fruits of their long years of labor. They traveled a bit, taking a trip to San Antonio to visit Catherine and her family, another trip to Austin to see the capital and marvel at how much the state had grown and changed. But they always returned to the ranch with relief, finding that nowhere else felt quite like home. More grandchildren arrived, and then great-grandchildren, as their family continued to expand and flourish. Rosalie kept meticulous records in a series of journals, documenting birthdays and marriages, first words and first steps, making sure that future generations would know their family history. Emma remained one of Rosalie's closest confidantes, and the sisters spent many afternoons together, reminiscing about their childhood and the hardships they had endured, grateful for the security and happiness they had found. When James died unexpectedly in 1908, Rosalie was there to support Emma through her grief, just as Emma had always been there for her. In 1912, Rosalie and Ethan celebrated their 34th anniversary quietly, with just their immediate family. Ethan was 72 now, and Rosalie was 64, and while they were both still relatively healthy, they could feel the weight of years beginning to slow them down. "You remember that first breakfast I cooked for you?" Rosalie asked as they sat together on the porch of the house Ethan had built for her all those years ago. "Scrambled eggs and salt pork," Ethan said with a smile. "Best meal I ever ate." "It was terrible," Rosalie protested. "I was so nervous my hands were shaking and I oversalted everything." "It was perfect," Ethan insisted. "Because you made it for me. Because it was the first of thousands of meals we would share together." They watched the sun set over the land they had worked together to build into something prosperous and enduring. Thomas and Sarah lived in the original ranch house now, raising their own children there, while Rosalie and Ethan enjoyed the peace of their later years in the larger house. "I've been thinking about what I want to leave behind," Ethan said suddenly. "My legacy, I suppose you'd call it." "You've left an incredible legacy," Rosalie said immediately. "4 children who are all good, productive citizens. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will carry on the family name. A ranch that will support generations to come. What more could anyone want?" "I want to make sure people remember that kindness matters," Ethan said. "That one good deed can ripple out in ways we never imagine. That helping someone when they need it most can change the course of their entire life." "Then we'll make sure they remember," Rosalie promised. "We'll tell our story to anyone who will listen. We'll make sure our grandchildren and great-grandchildren know that their family was built on a foundation of compassion and love." True to her word, Rosalie began writing their story in detail, filling page after page with memories of that first morning, of their courtship and marriage, of the children they had raised and the life they had built. She wanted future generations to understand that their family had not always been secure and prosperous, that there had been a time when their grandmother had been so desperate she had resorted to stealing. In the spring of 1915, Ethan fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor came and did what he could, but at 75, Ethan's body simply did not have the strength to fight the infection. Rosalie never left his side, holding his hand and talking to him even when he drifted in and out of consciousness. Their children gathered, along with as many of the grandchildren as could make the journey, and the house was filled with quiet voices and worried faces. On a warm May evening, with Rosalie beside him and his family surrounding the bed, Ethan opened his eyes one last time. "Rosalie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "I'm right here, my love." "Best decision I ever made," he said, his eyes on her face. "Giving you that basket of eggs." "Best thing I ever did was accept it," Rosalie replied, tears streaming down her face. "Love you," he breathed. "Always have, always will." "I love you too," Rosalie said. "Now and forever." Ethan smiled, squeezed her hand one more time and closed his eyes. A moment later he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that Rosalie felt in every part of her body. They had been together for 37 years, had built a life and a family, had loved each other through every challenge and joy. Now he was gone, and she felt as though part of her soul had been torn away. But she was not alone in her grief. Her children surrounded her, offering comfort and support. Emma moved into the house for several weeks, taking care of Rosalie the way Rosalie had once taken care of her. The grandchildren came and went, bringing food and flowers, sharing memories of their grandfather. Thomas spoke at the funeral, his voice breaking as he talked about the man his father had been. Kind, honest, hardworking, devoted to his family. He talked about the morning his parents had met, about how his father's simple act of kindness had set in motion everything that came after. "My father taught me that how we treat people matters," Thomas said. "That we should always choose compassion over cruelty, generosity over selfishness." He lived those principles every day of his life, and because of that, he left the world a better place than he found it. They buried Ethan in the small cemetery on the ranch, under an oak tree that he had planted when they first married. Rosalie stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and said her final goodbye to the man who had been her partner, her best friend, her great love. The months that followed were difficult. Rosalie struggled to find purpose without Ethan beside her, found herself constantly turning to tell him something before remembering that he was gone. But gradually, with the support of her family, she began to heal. She threw herself into finishing the written account of their lives, determined to complete it while the memories were still fresh. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the stories and traditions that Ethan had valued. She worked in her garden, finding peace in the familiar rhythms of planting and tending and harvesting. Emma was her constant companion, and the two sisters grew even closer in their later years. They would sit together for hours, talking about their lives, about the people they had loved and lost, about the miracles they had witnessed. "You ever think about that morning in the henhouse?" Emma asked one afternoon as they shelled peas together on the porch. "Every day," Rosalie admitted. "I think about how terrified I was, how desperate. And then I think about Ethan's face when he handed me that basket, about the kindness in his eyes. It changed everything, Emma. In that single moment, our entire future shifted." "He was a good man," Emma said softly. "The best," Rosalie agreed. "I was blessed beyond measure to have him in my life, even though it was not long enough. 37 years felt like both forever and the blink of an eye." Rosalie lived for another 8 years after Ethan's death, surrounded by the family they had created together. She saw more grandchildren marry, welcomed more great-grandchildren into the world, and even lived to see the birth of her first great-great-grandchild, a little boy that Thomas's oldest daughter named Ethan in honor of the grandfather she had adored. As her health began to fail in the winter of 1923, Rosalie gathered her children around her bed and gave each of them a letter she had written, sharing her wisdom and love, expressing her pride in the people they had become. She gave Thomas the original basket that Ethan had filled with eggs that morning so long ago, carefully preserved all these years. "This is where it all started," she told him, her voice weak but her eyes clear. "One basket of eggs given in kindness. Remember that when you feel like your actions do not matter, when you wonder if helping someone will make a difference. It matters. It always matters." On a cold February morning, Rosalie passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Emma holding one hand and Catherine holding the other. She was 75 years old, and she had lived a life rich with love and meaning. They buried her beside Ethan, under the oak tree that had grown tall and strong over the years. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, to honor the woman who had been the heart of their family. Thomas spoke at her funeral, just as he had at his father's, and he told the story one more time of the morning his mother had been caught stealing eggs, of his father's unexpected kindness, of the love that had grown from that simple act of compassion. "My parents taught me that love is not just a feeling, but a choice we make every day," he said. "A choice to be kind, to be generous, to see the best in people even when they are at their lowest." They chose love every single day of their marriage, and because of that, they built something beautiful and enduring. They built a family, a legacy, a testament to the power of compassion. Years later, the story of Rosalie and Ethan Pierce was still told around dinner tables and passed down through generations. The basket that had held those first eggs was kept in a place of honor, a reminder of where the family had come from. The painting commissioned for their 25th anniversary hung in the main house, a visual representation of the moment that had changed everything. Their descendants grew and prospered, spreading throughout Texas and beyond. But they never forgot the lesson at the heart of their family history: that kindness matters, that compassion can change lives, that choosing to help someone in their moment of greatest need can create ripples that extend far beyond anything we can imagine. The ranch remained in the family, passed down from generation to generation, worked by hands that carried Ethan and Rosalie's blood, sustained by the values they had lived and taught. And every year, on the anniversary of that morning in the henhouse, the family gathered to celebrate not just two people who had loved each other, but the enduring truth that love, kindness, and compassion are the foundation of everything worth building. Because in the end, that was the real legacy of Rosalie and Ethan Pierce. Not the land they had owned or the wealth they had accumulated, but the love they had shared and the kindness they had shown, rippling out through time to touch lives they would never know, creating a family bound together not just by blood, but by the values that had defined their remarkable life together.